Welcome everybody to the Planet MicroCap Showcase Virtual. I'm your host, Robert Kraft, on behalf of SNN Network, and thank you all for joining us today. This next panel at our event is titled Past, Present, and Future of Psychedelics, and is being graciously hosted by Graham Pechenik from Calyx Law. And I'd also like to mention that all of the companies featured here on this panel today will be presenting at the event on April 21st and 22nd, tomorrow and the following day. HAVLF Sciences will be presenting at 12:30 p.m. Eastern on Wednesday, April 21st. Novamind will be doing their presentation at 10 a.m. Eastern on Thursday, April 22nd. And MagicMed will do their presentation at 2 p.m. Eastern on Thursday, April 22nd. And with that, Graham, take it away.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you for inviting me to host this panel. I'm really excited to be here today. I'm delighted to be with everyone. I think most people now are probably familiar with the resurgence of interest in psychedelics, often referred to as the Psychedelic Renaissance, at least in broad outline. Just to give a little recap for those who may not be, psychedelics were widely used in clinical practice in the 1950s and 60s. Tens of thousands of patients were treated, thousands of scientific papers were written. Of course, there was a backlash against the counterculture, which resulted in the Controlled Substances Act in 1970, ultimately the so-called war on drugs. Starting around the 1990s, there was a big renewed interest in research that really picked up in the 2000s. Of course, in the last few years, in particular, psychedelics have really re-entered the mainstream consciousness. Michael Pollan's 2018 book, How to Change Your Mind. Now it feels like a day doesn't go by when there's not another article on the benefits of psychedelics and hope for their use. Not to mention all the decriminalization and legalization efforts around the country. So at this point, there's been over a couple dozen psychedelics companies that have gone public, incredible amount of investor interest. But I think people are still often surprised about the variety of business models in the psychedelic space and just how many different opportunities people are pursuing and that there are out there to pursue. And that's really why I'm so excited to have these three companies here with me on this panel today, because I think the paths of each of them really demonstrates just how vibrant this psychedelic industry is. So maybe with that, just a brief introduction from each of you about your company. If I could start with you, Tim, if you want to tell me a little bit about HAVLF.
Pleased to be here and not be on the panel. My background, I've got about 30 years in packaged goods. I joined Psychedelics just over a year ago. HAVLF has two primary strategies. One is to build a supply chain of naturally derived APIs to support the industry. And the second is launching a retail range of natural health products using non-restricted compounds. So we're pursuing both of those, and right now very focused on executing our business strategy.
Thank you. How about Yaron? Can you tell us a little bit about Novamind, please?
My name is Yaron Conforti. I'm a co-founder and the CEO of Novamind. Novamind is focused on clinics and clinical research for psychedelic medicine. So I'll be happy to share more of that a bit later. My background is in venture capital investing, and look forward to sharing the details of our work with Novamind, which has been going on about 2.5 years now.
Great, thank you. And Dr. Joe Tucker. Joe, how about MagicMed?
Thanks, Graham. Thanks for that. And actually, it's really great to be here with Yaron and Tim and yourself. So thanks for the opportunity. Yeah, so my name's Joseph Tucker. I'm a scientist by training, originally biochemist, molecular biologist, but been a drug development guy for the last 20 plus years, I guess, generally mostly as CEO. MagicMed is coming at this whole industry from the perspective of, it's very much a big pharmaceutical opportunity here, a big opportunity to come at new clinical applications. And what we think is needed is a whole bunch of new drug candidates, like thousands of drug candidates. So that's what we're doing at MagicMed, is creating a really, really large portfolio of new drug candidates and then partnering with the other companies in the industry.
Great, thank you, Joe. And I'm looking forward to delving more into that on our discussion today. Maybe to start, I mentioned that psychedelics are garnering an enormous amount of attention by policymakers, by, of course, investors, by consumers and patients. Maybe Tim, to put it back to you, why do you think all this interest and why now?
Well, Graham, I think what we're seeing is the convergence of a bunch of mega trends. First of all, mental health is a huge issue, a growing issue. I think there's a lot of discussion now about the echo pandemic that will follow the COVID crisis, with people have been affected by that on a global basis. So that growing mental health is one. The second is the fact that mental health issues have come out of the shadows, and it's now okay to not be okay. It wasn't that long ago that we called those people crazy and we put them in asylums and sanatoriums. And we've largely destigmatized people seeking support for anxiety, depression, PTSD, or whatever. I think the other thing is a lot of people have become, frustrated and wanting to find an alternative to pharmaceuticals, whether it's sexual dysfunction, weight gain, dependency, whatever it is. They're seeking alternatives, and so I think that that's happening. And I think we're also seeing policymakers waking up to those trends, and the things like the decriminalization in Oregon and Washington, D.C. and Ann Arbor and other are just indications of that, as are the increasing number of end-of-life exemptions being granted to patients in Canada. So I think all of those trends are coming together to create a new opportunity and new interest in this industry.
Yeah, it definitely sounds like there are lots of converging trends here. Are there any particular ones that you feel that you're following, Yaron or Joe?
Sure.
Go ahead, Yaron.
Yeah, thanks, Joseph. I'm happy to chime in on behalf of Novamind in terms of your question was about trends. And, I concur with what Tim was describing as a convergence. There's a lot of layers to this. Novamind, is a unique position because we're currently operating a network of clinics. So it's sort of a bottom-up perspective where, again, one of the things Tim mentioned, the fact that the destigmatization, if you will, where it's okay not to be okay, using Tim's words exactly. So we're seeing those in the form of patients and clients. We have a network of 4 clinics now that saw 20,000 plus client visits last year. And, in short, there's a demand. People are starting to be okay with not, with the fact that they're not okay. And our model has and continues to evolve to mainstream psychiatry in a way where it's much less intimidating than the current environment. So from a trend perspective, I can tell you in the data and some of the things that we reference in our news, we're seeing year over year more people coming in, and more people coming in for the alternative modalities specifically that we deal with today. So things like ketamine that represent a path for all of us as an industry, and the guys on the line today or on the panel today, towards the alternatives that'll be available. So even ketamine, from our perspective, people understanding, accessing, and then seeing real outcomes is a huge shift, and that would be a trend, obviously, that keeps our clinics busy.
Yeah, I agree with Yaron and Tim, of course, what you guys said, bang on. I would add to that as the propeller head that, the science, we're really seeing so much more work, as the area is becoming, very topical, and as things are opening up, there's just an explosion of work going on in this space, which really enables people to understand better what's going on, why it's working. And that means, the likelihood of having a positive outcome when you're developing a new modality, a new therapy is all the greater. So I think it's a confluence of all the events that everybody here has mentioned.
That's great. And one of the trends that I'm seeing is this trend towards more in new molecules. So some of the molecules that people may be familiar with, MDMA, of course, is now in phase 3 trials through MAPS. The drug Psilocybin from the magic mushroom is in several trials approaching phase 3 by 2 different companies, Compass and Usona. And a number of other so-called classic psychedelics that people may know about are also in clinical trials. But it seems like many companies might be looking to move beyond these so-called classic psychedelics to other new compounds. And maybe one of the trends there is the development of new drug compounds. Do you see roles for these types of compounds, and kind of how does the work that MagicMed is doing sort of fit in with that trend?
Yeah, I agree, Graham. I certainly think that, from our perspective, we think that's going to play a big role in the future. It's certainly not an exclusive role. There's a lot of there's a lot of roles for existing older molecules to play for sure. But the power of creating new molecules, of course, allows you to modify side effects or mitigate side effects or create the kinds of outcomes you want. Split up the market, if you will, for an ideal molecule for each indication. So I certainly think that there's a big role for that, in particular because, again, in our opinion, this is much more of a true medical or clinical kind of space than, let's say cannabis ever was. This is the kind of space that really is in the domain of the regulatory agencies like FDA and Health Canada. And therefore, everyone is more comfortable with novel molecules that have, improved outcomes for the patients, reduced side effects, that kind of thing. So yeah, I certainly think that there's a big opportunity there, and that's why MagicMed is so focused in that particular domain.
That's great. Yeah, and one of the things that I think you kind of pointed out in your answer is that these drugs are often given together with psychotherapy. So these aren't, in the main, at least the compounds that are currently in trials, just take-home molecules that people can pick up from their pharmacy, but these are things that are given along with some treatment protocol. And Yaron, so one of the things that Novamind is working on is really building this infrastructure for clinical treatment and also for clinical research and retreat centers. So maybe if you could tell me a little bit about how the development of psychedelic assisted therapy and the the infrastructure for that and the treatment protocols and how sort of Novamind is working to bring that forward, especially as new drug compounds like MagicMed is creating will come on the market. How does that sort of play along with the work that Novamind is doing?
Yeah, it connects very directly to the work we're doing, and we spend a lot of time focused on just this. So the first point is that the Novamind view is a compound agnostic view, and what I mean by that is that all participants and observers in the psychedelic space should note that it's really unprecedented what's happening in the drug development landscape, starting with the compounds themselves, a few of which the first ones are obviously off patent in the case of psilocybin and MDMA, and you have not-for-profit and for-profit entities bringing those through the clinical phase process. So from our perspective, rather than attaching ourselves to any one entity or any one compound, the view is agnostic in the sense that different compounds, are better suited for different indications. So, for example, MDMA being used, the indication of focus is PTSD, and psilocybin they're focusing on indications that include MDD or major depressive disorder and treatment-resistant depression. So, not all compounds are all things to all people, and recognizing that on the clinical research front, you mentioned, we have a very symbiotic relationship between the clinical research work we do and the clinics themselves. And the thinking is fairly clear, in fact, and it's that we can participate and help lead the clinical research when these new therapies are available on the market and at scale. We'll be very well positioned to facilitate the safe experiences. So you mentioned, Graham, and I think it's worth reminding everybody in context that these are not intended to be self-administered drugs. And really, from a drug development perspective, the most interesting thing that's happening is that we're creating a path for medicine, combining medicine with a therapeutic process, or combining medicine with a therapy process, to be specific. So whereas culturally, psychiatry, both the profession and the culture, has taken different views, some focusing on the molecules themselves, and obviously we saw that with the model that exists today in the form of SSRIs and other related pharmaceuticals, and the other focused on therapy. So there's a really an unprecedented thing going on here, and our perspective is to be involved in all of it. So you'll see some of the audience or the panel members may be familiar. We've done work with MAPS, a not-for-profit, obviously, and we've done work for Merck, one of the biggest pharma companies in the world. So both the clinical research platform and the clinics are a tool to really bring the best therapies to market, participate in the sense that we have a lot of value to add because we have a lot of experience researching and providing those. and support as many therapies as we can in that respect.
Yeah, that's great. And one of the things we've heard a bit about so far is these compounds and the use of these compounds. But I guess a question that may be on some people's minds is where are these compounds going to be produced, and who's going to be providing them? Tim, at HAVLF, you mentioned that you're working to become a supplier for some of these regulated compounds. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, the opportunity that we saw in the space was that a lot of the studies that are being fielded right now are using synthetic psilocybin, so it's the molecule. And we see two opportunities there. One is we believe that there's opportunity for the entourage effect with a full spectrum. There's lots of other compounds in these mushrooms that we don't fully understand what they do, but anecdotally we know that people that have used synthetic versus naturally derived have a different experience. So we see that. And the second thing is that some patients have rejected synthetics because they want something that's a naturally derived product, much like synthetic THC didn't find much of an audience because people were seeking a natural solution. So we're building a end-to-end supply chain of APIs, both isolate as well as broad spectrum, from a range of genetics to support researchers and ultimately to support formulators.
Yeah, that's great. And I guess one of the other avenues that some people may have heard about with psychedelics is their use also in microdosing, or what's called microdosing, where people take a very low dose of a psychedelic, sometimes for therapeutic purposes, or maybe to help with creativity or something. And there's been also a controversy in this space about whether the hallucinatory effect of a psychedelic is actually necessary for its therapeutic effect, or whether in fact they may be separated. And there's been some research coming out on that that shows people potentially might be able to get some of the benefits of a psychedelic without having the hallucinations with the psychedelic effects. Joe, is MagicMed doing any research in that area? Or do you think any of the compounds that you have might be helpful for others who are doing research in that area? Or is that something that you're investigating?
Yeah, it's certainly something we're very interested in. And I guess I'll say in this regard, like Yaron, we're also agnostic. If a molecule requires the hallucination or doesn't require the hallucination, either is fine with us. Our intention is to make many variants of all different flavors. Having said that, it's certainly a very, very interesting part of all this and central to the theme of the modality of delivery of the therapy, right? And we're seeing that really interesting studies have just come out in the last week or so that strike right to the heart of this, right? I think we've all heard of the new Carhart paper that compares to SSRIs. Of course, if you take a look at that, it's very interesting. Both sides got the psychotherapy part of it. One got an SSRI and the other got the psilocybin, and the results were about the same. Of course, so one's having one is having the hallucination, one is not. Of course, all molecules involved are serotonin agonists for all the different serotonin agonists. So what's really going on in there? Not clear, right? And we're having these animal studies that just came out as well that say if you block the serotonin, the 2A receptor, the one which mediates the hallucination, again, in an animal model, now it looks like you still get the antidepressive benefit without the hallucination, but it's in rodents. Sure is interesting, right? Right at the core of this, do you need to get the hallucination and therefore use the clinic setting and the psychotherapy or not? Or is it a blend? Who knows? Sure is interesting. I think all of us are trying to make sure that we're able to work with whatever turns out to be the case. And yeah, it's something that we are looking at closely, doing work of our own to try to add our own knowledge to the general pool of information.
Yeah, that sure is interesting. I mean, do you see some of these compounds potentially leaving the clinic and becoming take-home medications if perhaps the psychedelic effects aren't necessary?
That would be the goal for sure. If it turns out that the hallucination is not required, then, what an exciting opportunity to come up with, whatever it is that's going on here seems to be potentially a new paradigm, a new mechanism. So which in theory then should be able to help address patients that are inadequately addressed right now. So certainly, yeah, if the hallucinations is not required, that would be a big target for us and others, for sure.
And then, I mean, that makes me wonder sort of where these blend into from going from the clinic to take-home medications to potentially medications that one could even perhaps buy over the counter. Or I know, Tim, you're working on some with your sort of other prong of your approach, functional mushroom and natural health products. Do you see these trends as being sort of intertwined, or kind of where do you see the dividing line between the psychedelics and the natural products, or do you really see them as being separate?
We see them as being separate but complementary. I mean, whether it's lion's mane or reishi, or even if you go to some other compounds like rhodiola, where you have benefits to people, whether it's increased focus or helping with sleep or whatever, it's all about the overall health of the brain, and that's so essential to overall health of the human being. And so, the compounds that aren't restricted, that we can use for natural health products, we think are highly complementary. And just to comment on the micro dosing versus macro or hero dose, I think that's the whole promise, is that you can have a therapeutic benefit without the consequence of a hero dose where you lose a day or maybe even a weekend. And it opens it up for more patients. It opens up for more indications as well. And so that's the promise of the industry. And I feel that we're actually in the industry of hope, because I think that the promise for these compounds is to allow people to live a normal life, because so many people that are suffering from, whether it's anxiety, depression, or PTSD, the way they get through the day is they find their blend of medicine that numbs them to the point that they can get through the day. And I think that path too often leads to suicide, because people just get tired of being numb, and they want to, they either want to live their life or not live. And so we're in the industry of hope that people can get back to normal lives.
Yeah, that sounds like a really good way of framing it. I mean, even if they're separate, the psychedelics, even perhaps microdosing and the natural health products, seeing them both being together, people taking control of their mental health and having hope again, especially when the destigmatization starts, coming more to the fore. With regard to the natural health products, are there any that you can discuss that you're working on? I think I read somewhere that you have some functional teas. Like, are you putting these in products? Are these things available now to consumers?
Yeah,
maybe you can tell us more about your work there.
Our first 7 products are going to be available in May in British Columbia. We'll be expanding geographically from there, expanding to the US next year. We are looking at some other formulas that I can't talk about yet, but we're doing some creative things. And we did recently announce the acquisition of a manufacturing facility that it will allow us to get into functional foods. The first that we've announced is going into functional teas. And again, it'll be pairing a time of day to a product. So a nighttime tea that helps you sleep, a morning tea that helps you to wake up, a midday tea that helps you to focus. The statistics around how many students are taking Adderall right now for focus is a bit frightening. So if we can find something that's less of a toll on the body than Adderall that can continue to have that focus, I think that'd be a great solution. So yeah, we're going to be doing a lot of creative things in the space. There's just a lot of directions to go. We just want to find the ones that are going to benefit the most people.
Yeah, I mean, that's really an optimistic way to look at things, and I really see this as bringing health to many people. Joe, you had mentioned this groundbreaking study from last week from Robin Card-Harris's lab, where psilocybin was shown to be as good as, or maybe even have advantages over, escitalopram, which people know, Lexapro, the SSRI, considered really a first-line treatment for depression. Really, I think makes people wonder, when should we expect big pharma to start getting interested? And Yaron, you noted that I think Novamind and Merck are working together. I think Novamind is a key clinical research site for an antidepressant for treatment-resistant depression for Merck. So maybe I'll start with you. I mean, do you see big pharma? Obviously, they have with Novamind already, but how do you see big pharma, showing their interest or getting more involved in the psychedelic space? How do you see that unfolding?
I won't offer up an opinion on how I see it unfolding, but I'll give you my perspective on what's going on present day and how we're working with clients. And I'll also just allude back to some of the things that both Tim and Joseph touched on in terms of the next generation psychedelics, if you will, or the next generation, pharmaceuticals in general. You mentioned the Merck study, so that's a phase 2 trial with Merck that's focused on a new drug for treatment-resistant depression. I think it's a signal for everybody that big pharma has its own ambitions and obviously its own balance sheets to pursue this category. So if you consider the cultural shift, the policy shift, the things we talked about at the beginning of the conversation, they're pursuing the same markets, and there's really a desperate need for new drugs and new tools. So that's confirmed both by the professionals and obviously the patients that are demanding those. We see activity on a broad spectrum. There's another company that we're doing some work with called Bionomics, and it's fairly well known in the psychedelic space because they're bringing a new therapy to market for PTSD. So a much smaller company than Merck, and if anybody wants to look up that transaction we did with them, we're also being evaluated as a clinical research site for that study, where, as you mentioned, we're a key clinical research site for Merck already. So I mentioned MAPS as well, the work that our chief medical officer does with the current MDMA trials. So it's really a spectrum. Going back to some of the things that were being described in terms of the next generation drug development, it's interesting because, I think we spoke about it as, macro doses and macro trips as a consequence. And I'm not certain, again, I think it's very complicated. I don't have a strong conviction yet because I don't think there's enough therapies that are widely accessible to really compare and contrast. But, I'm also not a medical doctor, and that's why I have a chief medical officer and a partner in the business. But I will offer up that the general understanding for the lay people out there, including me, is that the default mode network and the resetting of that network, so to speak, there's a positive correlation there with the dose curve. So with something like ketamine, for example, which is very well understood, which we offer in our network of clinics, and which really does provide a path here because in terms of both a policy and a treatment protocol perspective, because it's disassociative. So the dose curve on ketamine is really well known. The efficacy and harm profile on things like MDMA and psilocybin are well known, but maybe the dose curve not as well known. So taking into account some of these things, my view now, it's based on my own experience and I suppose some of the feedback from our patients that in many cases you're looking at very different experiences that you're catalyzing along that dose curve. So where appropriate, what we might deem as a consequence, both in terms of the time, the emotional risk, the amount of care involved, the cost even, which is something that we work on, the potential outcomes far outweigh what we might consider in today's context as consequences. So I'm not certain that the path towards drugs that are self-administered, that, for example, mitigate or entirely eliminate the hallucinogenic effects, I'm not certain from a personal perspective that that's the drug development model or the care model. As I said previously, the focus for me is, it's combining the medication with the therapy. We can do that legally with ketamine. There's a lot of data on it. We will, in the coming years, be able to do it with MDMA and psilocybin, but people need to recognize, 23 and 2025 are the sort of the FDA timelines, best case scenarios for those approvals. To have them available at scale and well understood is going to take many, many years. So I think what you'll see definitively, at least in let's call it a 5-year time frame, before any of these new drugs may be approved, is the focus on getting those. Again, we're defining them as macro doses without any scale, right? Without any dose curve, but that again, drugs that are not intended to be self-administered require significant participation from the therapists, which has an outsized impact on the outcomes, take into account certain settings. I won't keep going on, but this is the level of care or the model, as I said, delivery of care that we're focused on. And I think that's what you'll see proliferate for at least 5 years, if not more, before any of these new drugs come to market.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that really is a big hurdle. And actually, I think I'll invite you to go on because, it's really important to make these into more widely accessible therapies. But how is that going to happen? And so Novamind, I believe you have some clinics now in Utah and some retreat centers. Is there anything you can tell us about your plans to sort of expand the access points to these treatments to people, across the country or, even outside the country?
Yeah, I mean, our ambitions are definitely global. We've made a couple of investments in the Netherlands. We have a therapeutic retreat offering in Costa Rica that's setting up for end of this year. So those are actually investments and operations where they're located in jurisdictions where those compounds are legal. So in terms of providing access to those, until and unless they're legal in the United States or North America, we'll only refer, and when appropriate, certain clients to those experiences. Going forward, the United States is a priority. I'm often asked about our clinic expansion because we've been very public, explaining to people that we've raised money and we went public really to fund that expansion. It's not capital intensive in that we don't buy real estate, but it's capital intensive in that if you want to roll out dozens and dozens of clinics, you both need the capital and the human capital to do that. So really our focus, I'll give you a sort of a 12-month outlook, is more on the human capital. We're well capitalized to accomplish what we need to do now. I've guided at a high level that we'll double the amount of clinics that we have now by end of year, so from the current 4, and a good chance we'll exceed that. So you'll see new clinics opening in the state of Utah and outside of the state of Utah. When I said we're focused on the human capital component, it's because in some respects we have priority jurisdictions for sure, where you see policy moving, places like Oregon and Colorado, for example. But it really is about where the practitioners are. So our model works because of our CMO, Dr. Reed Robison, and he's been operating that model since 2016. There is a peer group like Reed that has deep experience providing ketamine-assisted psychotherapy. Also, Spravato would be another alternative modality that some practitioners have a lot, or at least some experience with, and others don't at all because it's only been available since 2019. For people listening to the panel, Spravato is a prescription form of ketamine. It was a drug that developed by Janssen. So finding the practitioners and the partners to partner in those clinics, lead as medical directors, and essentially replicate the service offering that we have at the 4 operating Novamind clinics. That's the priority. We have a group of those people that we're working closely with. So those become the first expansion targets in the US outside of Utah. And the last component that really drives our thinking in terms of clinic expansion is that, in fact, every single one of our clinics doubles as a research site. So that hasn't always been the case, but we've built it into our model, and all the clinics currently can double as research sites. Significance of that is that obviously we want to provide a patient population which is of a great deal of value to drug developers, whether it's MAPS or Merck, any end of the spectrum. It's also become very clear that our patients and clients really see it as a valuable offering to them. That is, that they want to have the choice to participate in some of this research, particularly when it's at the later stages. An example would be psilocybin. So if you're in the United States today and you suffer from a treatment-resistant condition, you cannot get the legal supervised treatment that you would in other jurisdictions with psilocybin. The only way you would get that treatment in North America is to be involved in a clinical trial. So for our clients and patients, that opportunity compared to going into the underground therapy, and again, it's a matter in many cases of your connections or your affluence that get you access to those things. These are the models we work with today because, again, we don't want to build our business, whereas, much like Tim and Joseph, I think when they talk about the regulated process for naturopathic projects or products, excuse me, versus the pharmaceutical approach of long lead times, we look at it the same way. There's things we can do today, and there's things that we're going to be able to do in the future. We don't stop what we're doing today to only focus on the future. The two work in parallel.
Right. Yeah, I mean, that's a terrific explanation. That's great work that you're doing. And one of the last things you mentioned here was the pharmaceutical approach and the long lead times. And I think you mentioned too how some of these compounds, MDMA, psilocybin, might not be approved for quite a long time. That makes me wonder. It seems like you're probably starting to make some revenue already with your retreat centers. Tim, it seems like HAVLF, with your products already on retail shelves or soon to be. One thing that people often wonder about in the psychedelic space is with these compounds, it may take years and years of investment to get through FDA approval and maybe years and years out. It's an awful lot of time before revenue is generated. Joseph, though, I understand MagicMed has kind of some unique business models to getting some of that revenue in the near term by partnering with pharmaceutical companies. So maybe you can kind of provide some more information to us about that.
Sure. Thanks, Graham. And yeah, I couldn't agree with everything that Yaron just said. I find this whole discussion very interesting to see the very different business models with the different strengths and challenges that they face. And you're right. As Yaron just said, new molecules have to go through that, especially if you're in the pharma space, have to go through that entire process, which is long and time consuming. And so, absolutely the molecules that you see out there right now, the existing things like psilocybin and MDMA that, they were basically leapfrogged into mid-stage trials and are going very quickly. They'll certainly be out for years before new molecules hit the market. There's not much question of that. And so, that's one of the major risks for most biotech drug developers is you say, well, I've got one molecule and I got 10 years in front of me and I may have to raise, I don't know, 500 million in the market, something like that. Trust me, baby, right? I'll make it and no revenues for the next 10 years. That is your typical biotech story for sure. We're aware of that at MagicMed. So we're coming at it from a different point of view. We're making far more molecules than your typical biotech, not making one or two and rolling the dice. And because we're making so many, we're able to partner them with other companies very early on. And actually, the fact that the mechanism is not really understood, that there's so much we don't know in the industry is actually beneficial for us because we're able to partner with companies and do that R&D together with them, create the bespoke molecule for them that they then take on and they take on all that risk. And by working with them very early on, we generate revenues right at the beginning of the relationship. So, very unlike your typical biotech who usually has to wait a decade for revenues, we generate revenues from partnerships right up front. So in that regard, I think what we're doing is similar to what's going on at Tim and Yaron's companies in terms of access to revenues early on, which I think is probably going to be important. The survivors in this industry, there's so many companies, so many people, waving their hands and trying to get attention. I think the ones with early revenues are going to have a real advantage to survival.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
I agree, Joseph, on that, because that's one of the things we look at is it's really challenging to ask your shareholders to hold their breath for 3, 5, 7 years. And so, each of their 3 companies have come up with ways to do that. Our natural health products will have us in revenue in the first half of this year. And by having a facility in Jamaica where we're growing mushrooms, we'll be able to be supplying restricted compounds to appropriately licensed parties and have revenues on that side in the second half of this year. So it's just a different model so that you can not challenge your shareholders as much to be so patient. And the path is still fraught with risk for all of us, but by getting some revenue up front, you can mitigate some of those risks along the way. And I think that as you said, the survivors in this space will be the ones that find that path and are able to navigate those risks with at least some cash coming in.
It validates just as much as it funds, right?
Yeah. That's right.
one of the things you mentioned, Joe, was just the number of molecules that you're developing at MagicMed for pharmaceutical partners. I mean, it sounded like this was really an enormous amount of molecules. I mean, hundreds of millions of molecules even. I mean, I'm picturing in my mind, just warehouses of lab benches and scientists. I mean, how is it that you're able to, go through these hundreds of, millions of molecules to come up with the right ones to, to sort of partner with the pharmaceutical companies? Are they responsible for that, or do you do that? Can you tell me more about how that happens?
Yeah, you really need to be focused. You really need to think your way through it. And I'd say that, the short answer is artificial intelligence, actually. We're doing two things. We're combining a lot of, upfront, quick kind of in vitro work to start to draw structure, function, relationship understandings, but then plug that into artificial intelligence so that it can actually direct us. Sure, you can make 100 million molecules, but these ones aren't going to work out very well. So go focus on these ones over here. And so that's really the, the gist of it is, yeah, it's far too many things to actually test. It'll take me several lifetimes to test them all. So we use artificial intelligence to pick through the chaff to find the wheat, to quote my mom.
Yeah, well, one of the things my mom has been very interested in is all the decriminalization efforts, because she's wondering when the risk will be reduced enough so she can start growing mushrooms at her home. But so people probably have heard there are a number of decriminalization efforts. Many of them have passed. Some of them are ongoing in many jurisdictions around the country, different cities and states. Obviously, Oregon was huge news because it passed both decriminalization and legalization for psilocybin-assisted therapy in November. Of course, in Canada, I think it's been mentioned, there have been these Section 56 exemptions where people can get access to psilocybin, particularly for end-of-life care, but for other medical care. So with all this going on, I'm just curious what this means for your businesses, what this means if there are legalization or decriminalization efforts when you're working to get things through FDA approval, or what may seem to certain people as being, a path that's can be potentially in tension. Do you see opportunities through these efforts? Do you see concerns, maybe another cultural backlash that happened in the 60s if there's too much access right away, or kind of your thoughts on all of these efforts? Maybe Tim, can we start with you?
Well, first of all, I think that the decriminalization trends that we're seeing are, as I mentioned earlier, part of this tectonic force of public policy evolving and opening up. It's the same thing we saw in cannabis 8 years ago, where we started seeing people being granted exemptions for end of life. So we think that we're going to see more and more of that, and potentially groups being identified. And veterans, I think, would be one of the groups that would be at the front of that list that could be identified as a group that can be approved. And so, I do find it very encouraging. The threat, though, is we have one advantage versus cannabis, which is there's still that tension for investors in the U.S. between federally illegal and state legal, and these MSOs operating, and so you have institutional investors that are chased away. The good news is that everything that we are doing as an industry, we're doing as a company, we're doing as an industry, is legal with Health Canada and the FDA. We've taken away that tension between, is it legal or not legal? What we're doing is legal. When a pharmaceutical company creates a new heart drug, it's just as illegal as psilocybin until it's approved. So we're working within the rules as an industry, and I think that brings comfort to investors. So, but as these different areas are doing the decriminalization, yeah, that's showing public policy is evolving quickly, and that we will be getting to these approvals on whatever timeline we do. And psychedelic assisted therapy is at the front of the queue. Taking home your drugs and self-administering is way down the line as far as I see. But I think that the trend is there.
Yeah, Yaron or Joe, do either of you have any comments on this trend, or any ways you feel like it impacts your business?
I have just a little bit to add, and then I'll pass it over to Yaron. It's for me, it's the pharmaceutical industry has been making drugs that are otherwise illegal, opiates case in point, for decades. So the legality is kind of beside the point. generally speaking, when it comes to the pharmaceutical industry. What I think it does do, though, the opening up really helps a lot with the destigmatization. I think that is a very beneficial, very beneficial outcome, societally, for all the reasons that we've been talking about. I would add to it, though, the conversations that MagicMed has been having with big pharma, it's maybe predictable if you know big pharma, or I should call them innovation pharma. They're generally uncomfortable. They're kind of like a battleship, as a friend of mine likes to say, really slow to turn around. And their history with hallucinogenic agents is, hands off, right? And so it's going to take a little while before innovation pharma really wants to get too involved in that, generally speaking. So I think the more this becomes destigmatized in society, that'll probably help as well, to the extent that a hallucination or the psychedelic experience is required for the therapeutic benefit. But this probably is even more appropriate for Yaron, so I'll pass it over to you.
Thanks. At a high level, it's access, right? So that's what we're talking about. And I mentioned our operating clinics are, they're growing year over year 100%, and demand for those alternative modalities that are available are growing. Now, so access in that respect is about, in some cases, taking what's available, because there's a spectrum of capabilities with, just again, I'll focus on ketamine, that most people, they're not precluded from accessing. That is, it's legal. They just don't know about it. So engaging those people and getting them on a path where, in some cases you're stacking, or you're taking a stepping stone approach to other novel modalities. So widening access to primary mental health care, making people comfortable in that's the first problem, or the first priority. When it comes to special access for the things that aren't legal yet, we can talk specifically about psilocybin and MDMA. Talk about, it's been mentioned, the SAP protocol in Canada, and some similar efforts in the US. So you'll note I didn't mention that as an access point when I summarized them earlier. And the reason for that is because to date, there isn't a model there that will provide access at scale. So I think there's a huge benefit to those protocols and policies that provide special access to people who are in desperate need. And things like end-of-life distress in certain severe cases of PTSD. It shines attention on the indication, it shines attention on the access or lack thereof. But when you're talking about helping thousands or millions of people at scale, it really isn't something that's going to reach a lot of people. So while Novamind, the perspective is to work with those programs, and we are looking pretty closely at facilitating access. Again, in many cases, it would be less resource intensive to take someone from their existing jurisdiction, let's say it's Canada or the US, and take them to the Netherlands and provide them with that treatment. So the resources that you're seeing, in many cases, winning public battles, it's a great service to us all. Novamind's contributed to some of those agencies in Canada doing that work financially, because of course it moves us all forward. But a model for scaling access to this kind of care is going to, for better or for worse, require the FDA, first and foremost on a global level, the U.S. medical healthcare system, however perverse it may be, until and unless the system works within those parameters, we're not going to be able to help millions of people. So the Novamind model is really built on scale. We talked about it earlier that growing your business until that inflection point, until the new drugs come and everyone has access, is important. We recorded $1.3 million in our last quarterly revenue announcement, which people can look up. So again, it's alluding to what I've said, that there's a lot of things that we can provide to people, and people will benefit from access to. We'll continue to do that. And I guess that would include some of these special access policies where in certain cases, target groups, again, people, to use the word, who are particularly desperate in terms of the type of suffering they're dealing with, and we'll turn our attention to those cases. But for the most part, it's getting the model working at scale so that millions of people can have access.
Yeah, it really does seem like access is the really the critical ingredient here. So hopefully that will happen soon. Um, so we've talked a lot about the different sort of business models that each of you have. I notice you all have very different professional backgrounds too, and I kind of wonder if there's anything from your professional background that you bring to bear that you feel gives you kind of a unique advantage in the work that you're doing with your companies, or perhaps even in your personal backgrounds. I know for a lot of people who are in the psychedelic space, there's been something impactful from them that's influenced their decision to get into the psychedelics field. Maybe Tim, I'll start with you. Is there anything about your sort of personal or professional background, kind of the long history you had in, I think, consumer packaged goods or in cannabis that you feel really brings you an advantage in your work you have at HAVLF?
Well, so my professional background reinforces our strategy to pair our science team with an operations team so that we can execute those plans. And certainly on our natural health products, my consumer background is brought to bear and adds value. The science and clinical side of it is, as mental health side of it is through personal connection. I mean, I've raised 5 sons, 2 with anxiety disorder. My one son was suicidal at 14. By the way, they're all fine now, but I've got scar tissue. My youngest son has Asperger's. My middle son was hit by a drunk driver 6 years ago, became an opioid addict. I spent 2 years watching him disappear. And it was cannabis that saved his life. That got me in the cannabis space about 4 years ago. But seeing the promise that psychedelics and psychoactives offer for, all these different indications, like I said, we're in the industry of hope. And I hope that I can be a part of an industry, part of a company that delivers solutions to people so they don't have to go through what I went through. So that's what brings me here and keeps me motivated and engaged on a daily basis.
Oh, it's great to hear that your sons are doing well now. So hopefully that that hope will be carried through to many others too.
Yeah, it's regretful. I look in the rearview mirror and I realize that much of the medication that I administered to my kids was to make them easier to parent and not to make them better. And I really regret that in hindsight, but it took a long time to come to that realization.
Yeah, maybe Joe, I think your background was in drug development, and of course, you're sort of in that field as well today. Is that do you see that as being a really good fit? Is there any particular kind of unique things that you carried from your past to what you're doing now? Or are there any challenges that you feel are kind of new to what you're doing in the psychedelic space? Or how do you sort of feel your professional background prepared you for this, or maybe your personal story too?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks. I guess I'll comment on both. Like Tim, and I think probably like almost everybody, in my immediate family had, our own share of struggles with this, mental illness, uncle that committed suicide. My son-in-law died of opiate addiction, right? Like many people, all of these things have happened to me too. And so of course it makes it very personal, very real. You don't want this to continue for anybody, right? Kind of choking up a little bit, but yeah, I think we all probably have something like that. From a scientific background, I've been a neuroscientist pretty much my whole career. Everything I've been doing has to do with generally with things that affect the brain. So it's certainly, well, it's a black box. It's certainly a black box I'm comfortable working in, and coming at it from a drug developer, I do think gives me, advantages. I'm able to be dispassionate about it, and one of the questions that I get asked, as I'm sure many CEOs in the space get asked, is, what was your personal trip that convinced you to go down this path? And in other words, your personal psychedelic experience. And, I'm actually somebody who hasn't had one. And, and the way I look at it is, when these are going to be pharmaceuticals. And when you get to the FDA and the FDA is reviewing it, they're not going to say, okay, for the reviewers on this, did you all have a psychedelic experience prior to this? Okay, only the people that had an experience are going to stay and be in on the room for the voting. It's probably going to go the other way, right? So, I want to be completely dispassionate about this because I think that's how it's going to be judged at the end of the day. And so maybe that's something unique about me that I think is probably an advantage in this sector.
Thank you, Yaron.
Yeah, I think it's, in my case, I'm one of the people that has had a good amount of psychedelic experiences, both therapeutic and recreational. So it doesn't actually inform the Novamind business model, to the extent that I certainly have a passion and a deeply held conviction that there's other models for care that will work much better than the ones we have today. So that really comes from my experience, just like the other gentleman said. Being a fellow human being and existing or surviving this long. So, what I bring, I think, that's unique is that from a risk perspective, along with my co-founders, what we saw a couple of years ago, we incorporated the company together in early 2019. It was that our particular skill set, and I'm speaking of myself and two co-founders, that we built other businesses in cannabis, and if you look at our backgrounds, you'll see that. We have, we're really good at building businesses, and we're pretty good at investing, and Novamind has done a bunch of investing, so people can look into that. But what's required for us to be successful in something quite so sensitive and complicated is domain experts, right, that partner with ours. And in that case, we found the right partners. So Novamind certainly has the power of our group's capital market expertise and our business building background and the network and the resources that come from that. But the business itself and what drives it is built on the operating model that we in fact acquired, right? So we didn't reinvent the wheel. We didn't start clinics for the first time. We found someone, Dr. Robison, who I mentioned, our CMO, who's been operating with this model for many years and was able to prove that success as both a clinician and a clinical researcher. So the unique part of it is the complementary nature of those, the fact that we moved early enough, and we're continuing to move, I think, aggressively enough and early enough to create both, again, it's a model of care and a brand that people associate with that, so that when these things are legal, people will be comfortable coming to us, where appropriate.
Oh, that's great, and I would love to be able to talk about this for the rest of the day, but it seems like we're getting close to the end of our time. Do any of you have any final words or anything that we should have talked about that was important that we left off, just as we wrap up in the last few minutes?
I guess I would say that I think what we have represented here are three quite different business models, and yet I think they all have merit. There's no reason that they can't all exist simultaneously. So I think this has been a really interesting panel. Hopefully the audience has been enlightened seeing sort of the different perspectives, but I don't think any of this is, it's my way and not his way, not at all. I think there's complementarity and synergy through everything that we're seeing here today.
Yeah, it's really exciting to see the the number of different opportunities that there are, and I'm really excited to see even your companies work together at some point. So yeah, maybe before we go, if you can tell me if there's any best place to sort of follow the work you're doing or where to find you, and everybody can just go online, obviously, but if there's any particular place where you'd want to direct people.
Well, from my side, we have a very good website, MagicMedIndustries.com, all kinds of information up there. We even have a little YouTube series that is just supposed to be entirely educational. It's not promotional. It's just talking about the psychedelics sector and what you need to know. So our website's a great place to start, MagicMedIndustries.com.
Similar, our website, HAVLF.com, is a good place to go, or go to YouTube and just search for HAVLF on YouTube, and you'll find a number of videos that we've got posted there. Lots of information for people as well.
And for us, if you Google Novamind and psychedelics, you'll find out a lot about us. Check us out on Twitter and Instagram, LinkedIn. We're pretty active. We like to disseminate information as far and wide as we can.
Terrific. And like Robert said, there's going to be more of you at the conference with individual presentations. So I'm looking forward to seeing those myself, and I'm sure many of the audience members will enjoy the opportunity too. So speaking of opportunities, this one was really an honor for me. Thank you so much for letting me host this panel. I really had a great time today, and I hope you did as well. I learned a lot. Thank you very much for all of your time. And thanks very much to our audience for paying attention.
Great. Thanks.
Thanks.